is Carrie Sotner. I'm president and CEO here at Eastern State. Welcome everyone to be here. It's excited to have you all. I appreciate all the fanfare, the red, white, and blue. I'm a super nerd about July 2nd. I don't know if everybody knows this. I know you know this. This is the date that the Declaration of Independence was actually voted upon. And so John Adams was really psyched about this day. This is the day that he writes to Abigail Adams and says, this will be the day that everybody celebrates, that there will be, fanfare and celebrations and parades. So, John doesn't get a lot of credit and sometimes gets picked on in a lot of musicals. But thank you all for doing a lot of celebration for John today, and that he can stand up and not sit down and get a little bit of celebration. But today, what we're going to do is celebrate John Adams by talking about what the revolution was all about. And it was about dissent. And dissent is just a fancy word of saying, and we're going to stand up and talk about when we don't like things and we push back on things. And that's what the revolution is about in so many times, in so many ways, is this legacy of America of when we say, you know what, things aren't always right, and we're going to stand up and say when they're not right and how we want things to be and be a little bit different. And that's what this program is about today. It's talking about the legacy of America. It's talking about dissent in America and pulling around that revolutionary idea of dissent. And we've brought a brilliant scholar with us today, Dr. Matt Pinsker. Could everybody please say hello to Matt Pinsker and give him a big round of applause? The story that he's going to talk about today is a really interesting one, and it has a really strong connection to Eastern State and the history of Eastern State. So a little bit about Eastern State before we dive into it, and then Matt will make all those connections for us. So Eastern State Penitentiary, this place that you're in, is the physical embodiment of this idea that people had in the late 1700s. It was this idea in America, and it started with the Quakers, that they would do things differently in America. So it was around 1787, after the Revolution, before the Constitution, that we would do things differently around liberty. So the Revolution is over. Before the Constitution is designed, they are talking about liberty. They're talking about freedom. And they come up with this idea that they should do criminal justice and justice differently. And they come up with this idea that criminal justice system should be reformed. And they think of this place, that there should be a place where they think about how they should do criminal justice system differently. And they think of Eastern State Penitentiary. Now, it doesn't open until 1829, but the idea behind it is they're going to center people's human dignity behind that. And they want to think about how they respect people's human dignity and hold their inner light. So this is the birthplace of criminal justice reform. It is also at the same time the birthplace of solitary confinement. They thought in solitary confinement, people would be able to hear what they believe was their inner light, or what they thought was the inner light of God in them. But when they invented solitary confinement, they invented probably one of the cruelest ways to incarcerate people, in isolation for years. And we know, and they did then too, we know today, and they knew then, that it was one of the most traumatizing experiences that you can do to somebody, is put them in isolation for long term. And we're talking just a week, just a few days can be traumatizing to people. Mental health crisis happens right away with solitary confinement. So the conversations that we have today and the work that we do here today is to not just preserve this site and make sure we have those conversations today, because this is still happening in our country today, solitary confinement, but to have the conversations about how do we talk about the justice system? What do we believe as a people and a world is fair and just? And how do we discuss it? And what do we believe is the right things to do in our laws, in our practice, in our policy, and with each other as neighbors and in our communities? That's the work of Eastern State. So what we're going to do today is look at what people thought in different time periods about what was fair and what was just, and when people stand up against something that they feel is unfair and unjust. So one of those stories is the work of what Dr. Pinsker has done, Professor Pinsker, around a case in 1847. So I'll turn it over to you. And also, what I'm really psyched about is what the gift I got today is his new book. So, right, this is my weekend reading, because I already admitted I'm a nerd, and I'm really excited about this book. But Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln, by Matthew Pinsker. So amazing reads, a lot to look through. And Professor Pinsker here is a professor at Dickinson College and does some amazing work and is a great speaker on many different things, but is a Lincoln expert as well. So thank you for being here. And could you tell us a little bit more about this fugitive slave case of 1847? I'm getting the year right, correct?
Right, yes.
Right.
So thank you. It's great to be here. Forgive me for dressing a little casual. I mean, when the feel-like temperature breaks 150, I don't wear a sport coat, But I am here to talk about a case that involves Dickinson College, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, about 100 miles west of here. It involves some really determined freedom seekers from Maryland and their allies. It involves a know-it-all college professor, like me, from Dickinson. And then it involves these new records, old records from Eastern State that we rediscovered. I didn't rediscover them, but researchers found them and analyzed them just a couple of decades ago in ways that shed new light on something that we need to talk about, which is not just how you dissent in a democracy, but what forms of dissent are legitimate and how to balance criminal justice with criminal injustice. And so that's what I'm going to try to talk about today, very briefly, Lincoln style. The Gettysburg Address was only 2 minutes. I'm going to go more than 2 minutes, but I have to keep it under 20, okay? So let me start with this, okay? In the spring of 1847, in Maryland, there were a series of escapes from slavery. You know, the American Revolution is all about declaring freedom, but they didn't declare freedom for everybody. They had slavery at the same time. Some of the men who wrote that declaration owned people, but the people who read or heard about that declaration sought it for themselves. And so from the very beginning of the country, there were people who ran away from slavery. And those freedom seekers, or fugitive slaves, began to accumulate in greater numbers from Maryland in the 1840s. It was creating a crisis across the sections, the border between North and South, the Mason-Dixon line. And some of them were finding refuge in Pennsylvania, especially in South Central Pennsylvania, in places like Carlisle, where there were free blacks as well as white allies living there willing to protect them. Well, on June 2nd, 1847, some slave catchers from Maryland came and chased down some of the runaways, and they captured a trio of people. It's a remarkable story. It's a father named Lloyd Brown and his little girl, Anne. Now, she was only 10 years old. Is there anybody here who's about that age? How old are you? 11 years old. How old are you? So she was just a couple of years older than you. She was a slave, and she was running away seeking freedom with her father. They were captured in Carlisle. There was a woman named Hester. She was married to a free black man in Carlisle. Now, she's a slave in Hagerstown. Her husband had escaped sometime earlier, and he was now free, living in Carlisle. His name was George Norman. And she was trying to reunite with her husband. And Lloyd Brown was trying to save his daughter from a life in slavery. And they were captured and brought to the courthouse in Carlisle, which still stands. Has anybody ever visited Carlisle? Everything I'm about to tell you, you can visit the site where this happened. And it's connected in a very electric way to this site at Eastern State. Because what happened on June 2nd, 1847, is that George Norman, Hester's husband, tried to free her from the clutches of the constables and the slave catchers. And there was a fracas, and there's this growing tension. And there's a series of hearings about whether the local judge is going to give a certificate of removal to let these slave catchers bring these enslaved people back to Maryland. In Pennsylvania in 1847, there's no slavery. There had once been slavery in Pennsylvania, but it had long since been abolished. But there were also laws in Pennsylvania, state laws, that prevented people from using the local government to return fugitive slaves. And that's what this case is all about. That's where the know-it-all college professor comes in. So there's this brewing tension growing in Carlisle on the afternoon of June 2nd. They're upstairs in the courthouse. There's a crowd of black people and white people. They found a lawyer to represent the accused runaways. They actually filed a writ of habeas corpus accusing the slave catchers of kidnapping. So there's like dueling charges here. And this professor, his name was John McClintock. He had finished his morning classes, and he's taking a walk into the town square. I do the same sort of thing after I teach. And some local postmaster tells him, there's a fugitive slave case upstairs in the courthouse. You have to check it out. And he wanders up, and he listens to the arguments going back and forth between the lawyers and the judge. And he decides, in typical college professor fashion, that they don't understand the laws very well. And so he starts to interject and offer his opinion. And it all involves something that's going to have a lot of resonance that we need to talk about before this session is over, which is that Pennsylvania was one of the northern states that had just adopted something called a personal liberty law. Okay? Now, I bet everybody in this room has heard of the fugitive slave law, the federal laws that made it illegal to run away and help people run away. But how many people here have heard of the personal liberty laws? These were state laws passed in the North. In this case, they started in Massachusetts in the 1840s, and they offered a kind of sanctuary city policy, protection against federal authorities from using local and state government officials to enforce federal law. It's also called the anti-commandeering doctrine. And so the Pennsylvania Personal Liberty Statute had just been adopted in spring of 1847. The state had had personal liberty laws before, but the Supreme Court had ruled some of them unconstitutional. And so starting in Massachusetts in the late 1840s and continuing in Pennsylvania and other places, states began to pass laws to deny that local officials could be commandeered into enforcing the federal fugitive slave law. And so McClintock is saying, these runaways, Lloyd Brown and his daughter Anne and Hester, they can't be held in the local jail. That's illegal. It's against state law. It's a conflict between state law and federal law. And the judge seemed ignorant of the new law. McClintock said, I've got a copy of it in my room. I'll walk back and get it. Back then, they used to print the laws in the newspaper. He walks out to get the law, and in the meantime, the local crowds decide they can't wait for the professor, so they try to free the slaves. The slaves are being taken, the runaways are being taken from the courthouse upstairs to the local jail to be held until this is all sorted out. And there's a melee, and in this melee, one of the slave catchers gets trampled and beaten, and then in a few weeks, he's going to die from his wounds. He's one of the first slave catchers to die north of the Mason-Dixon line in the era of the crisis over slavery. When McClintock comes back, the constables and the local officials accuse him of being in charge of what they're calling a riot. This is like illegitimate resistance against the law. And so they're going to charge him and about 34 other people in town, black men and black women, with riot. And they're going to hold a trial in the summer of 1847. The professor is going to be acquitted, but 13 black men are going to be convicted, and 11 of them are going to be sent to Eastern State Penitentiary to serve 3 years of solitary confinement. Now, meanwhile, just so you know, Hester, George Norman's wife, he was one of the 11 convicted, George Norman. Hester escaped with Anne, the 10-year-old girl, but Anne's father, Lloyd, was captured, and he was taken back into slavery in Maryland. So she's separated from her father. The inmates arrive here in Eastern State Penitentiary, and as far as people in Carlisle were concerned, that was the end of the story. What's amazing to me as a historian is they had records here at Eastern State Penitentiary from the moral instructor. This was a man at the time named Thomas Larkham. His job was to meet with the prisoners, talk to them about their conversion or, in a sense, their recovery from their life of crime. But he was a very empathetic man. He understood that some of these men, some of these women who were in this prison weren't guilty. And so in his records, which they just rediscovered about 15 years ago from this case, he notes that several of these men are innocent, that the charges have been trumped up against them. He says George Norman was guilty, Hester's husband, and he writes in his records, he doesn't care that he's guilty. He justifies himself at all he did. You know, his attitude is, I'm protecting my wife. To hell with the law. But then he also says something in his records that I found kind of remarkable. Because John McClintock, the professor, said from the beginning in public he had stumbled onto this case and he had nothing to do with it. But in the records of the moral instructor, Thomas Larkham says one of the inmates who had been convicted said the professor knew about this all along. He's involved in this underground network that we have protecting these fugitives. Now, I don't know if he was in effect diming out Professor McClintock in revenge, or if he was venting, or if it was true. It's hard to tell. But one thing we do know is that this case reveals something interesting about the nature of the Underground Railroad and how people fought against slavery, and a lot of it is things that people don't understand. And I want to just talk about the legacy of that for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions, okay? So first things first, okay? I told you the story about what they're calling a riot in 1847. It wasn't a riot. It's not spontaneous. There's obviously a network of people who are involved in helping to protect runaway slaves, helping to rescue them if necessary, but certainly helping to employ lawyers to protect them in court. There's an attorney named Samuel Adair who shows up in court when Lloyd Brown, his daughter Anne, and Hester are arrested. How does that happen? They can't hire him. There's a network in place, and there's a word for that. And very few people have heard it, although people in Philadelphia, if you're a resident here, you should have heard this. It's called vigilance committees. When you think of the Underground Railroad, most people think of a network of safe houses and hidden tunnels, but the real Underground Railroad was a movement of people organized in committees, and they called themselves vigilance committees in cities like Philadelphia, in towns like Carlisle, and across the North. That's how resistance happens, through organization, through grassroots mobilization, through people going to meetings. And it happens through the courts. They are the ones who pay for and hire the lawyers. They're the ones who raise the funds to get it done. And by the way, I didn't mention this before, but I'll mention it now. What's amazing about that legal process, even in the age of slavery, sometimes it works. Because the Vigilance Committee in Carlisle hired the lawyers to represent those 34 accused. Like I told you, 11 of them got convicted and sent here, but they kept appealing the case, and the men did not serve 3 years here. They only served a year. The state Supreme Court threw out their conviction, saying that the punishment was too harsh for the charges that were leveled against them. So they returned home. Now, here's something tragic. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if George and Hester reunited. We don't know if they had a happy life together. We don't know if Lloyd Brown and his daughter Anne ever reunited. Now, I should say this, those records from the moral instructor, Thomas Larkham, I didn't find those. People working here and at the American Philosophical Society found them. There's a woman named Jen Koval and another woman named Anne Drydell who worked on this project and shared research with people like me and others at Dickinson. But at Dickinson, what we did, using digitized records, Ancestry.com, we found a record of a slave named Lloyd Brown who was shipped into slavery in the Deep South in New Orleans right after this episode in the summer of 1847. Now, I can't verify for sure that it's the same Lloyd Brown, but I think it is. I mean, I think what happened is that after he ran away, he got punished by being sent into slavery in the Cotton South, and he probably never reunited with his daughter. Last thing I want to say is that personal liberty statute that I talked about, that sanctuary city-style law, that's an example of what real legitimate dissent in America looks like, and it has always looked like, which is that sometimes in our American federal system, there's a collision between state laws and federal laws. And that conflict, that's real, and it can be intense. It doesn't have to be violent, but it has to be, hammered out in the courts through the process at the district level, the appeals level, and ultimately the Supreme Court level. Now, occasionally there is violence, like there was in Carlisle in 1847, like there has been in Minneapolis recently or elsewhere across the country. Violence is always wrong in a democracy. Sometimes people feel it's justified. I never say that in my classes. But what I do say is what you can see what happened in Carlisle, and what I think many of you think we saw what happened in Minneapolis, is that sometimes it's not the protesters who are provoking the violence, it can be the government. The government's not always right. The laws are not always right. And that's what dissent is about. It's about the collision of principles to try to get toward a more perfect union with more justice for everybody. So last thing I'll say, and then we can open up to questions, or in the spirit of what I just said, comments, like if you want to denounce me. Democracy is not the Greek word for perfect. Okay, this revolution that we're celebrating is not about perfection. It might as well be, though, about the Greek word for disagreement, because we've always been arguing over what freedom means and what justice means, and those arguments are fine. But from now on, for the next 250 years, we should work those disagreements out with ballots, not with bullets, okay? The revolution of 1776 is not the revolution that we fight in 2026. It's more like an evolution toward justice. That's where I'm going to leave it, and then we can talk or take questions and comments if you want.
Thank you. Every time you teach, I keep thinking, I wish I had you as a professor, because you're an excellent teacher. Can we just give him a round of applause for that?
Thank you.
I was lucky enough that years ago when I started at the Constitution Center, Professor Pinsker was the visiting scholar at the time. And I remember it was my first week there, and he taught a lunch. It was a brown bag lunch, and he taught it on a conversation we had on Freedom Rising, and it was fantastic. And you did put dissent in that conversation. Right. And so thank you very much for that. I love that you talked about the tensions, because we sometimes constantly feel like we have to have everything balanced, and that's what makes a healthy democracy. And it's innately in the tensions that make a democracy effective, that there should be constant tensions, there should be constant pushes and pulls. And when those tensions boil over to a point where it's unhealthy, that's not right either. But there is baked into the system is tension, and that is a good thing. Just too much is also not appropriate either. So let's dive into questions. I will always have 1 million. So if you don't have questions right away, don't you worry, I will cover it. But we can start with any questions from the audience. And I know we might have questions from the audience online as well. But does anybody want to start in the room with a question?
Is there anybody under the age of 15 who wants to start? Do you have any questions?
No pressure on the two
All
of
right.
you.
Is there anybody I don't want to offend anybody. Is there anybody over the age of 65 who wants to ask the first question? All right. Let's go.
In the back. Go for it, and I'll repeat it so everybody online hears it as well.
So you said for the inmates that came here, they only served 1 year?
In this case, they only served 1 year of their 3-year term because they won at the state Supreme Court level on appeal.
So the question was, they were assigned 3 years to serve. The question was, they only served 1 year. Now, just to give a frame of reference, typically when this place opened in 1829, typical how long people serve was around 2 years. So when we think about modern, how long people serve today, it has exploded in the last 10 to 20 years. So in the last 10 to 20 years, our justice system has gone from shorter time periods to, and then we always say explosions by the tens, the fives, the tens. So where 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was 5. Now it's times it by 25. So it's the 5s, the 10s, the 50s, the 25s. So our system has changed drastically, and you can look at those numbers. So the numbers that we see today are very, very different from the 1800s, very, very different from the 1850s. So a 3-year sentence was an extremely high sentence for that time period, just to put it in context for everyone. Now,
Hold on.
Yeah.
You know, it's such an important point, especially about the Underground Railroad. And I just want to underscore that point. So under the federal law, people rarely got prosecuted for helping runaway slaves. A handful of people in Pennsylvania got prosecuted for that, and they served months, not years, okay? But under the state personal liberty law, some people got prosecuted for kidnapping black people, kidnapping and holding them. One of them was a Philadelphia constable named George Alberti, okay? He got sentenced to 10 years for kidnapping. That's the difference between a free state and a slave state. Now, he only served 2 of those 10 years. He got pardoned. But you can see the difference in the scale of the punishment. Southern states didn't have personal liberty laws. They were slave states. They had what they called slave stealing statutes. And they punished people for helping people run away. And there's states like in Kentucky where a man served 19 years for slave stealing violations. So you can see that state laws mattered even more than federal laws in the Underground Railroad and the story of escapes from slavery. And yet, I would be surprised if any of you have ever studied those state laws. You focus on the federal law. But that's the point about the tensions within our system and federalism and how it still matters today.
And most incarcerated settings in America are state-based as
Right.
well. And then we're also, when you think about that, so there's 14 people arrested, and
There's almost 36 arrested and put on trial, and then 13 of them are convicted, 2 sent to local jails, and 11 sent here, including George Norman, Hester's husband.
And then what's the breakdown of those people based on race?
They're all black. There was only one white man indicted. That was the professor. He was acquitted. There were black women who were indicted and put on trial. They were acquitted.
Got it. Great. Any other questions from the group inside the room?
Can I say one thing about
Yeah,
Abraham
please.
Lincoln? Because I am a Lincoln scholar, right? Now, I said in my own little brief talk, I never recommend violence as resistance. That's me channeling Abraham Lincoln. That's his point. His point time and again was you can resist bad laws without violating those laws, risking violence, committing acts of violence. Now, that's not what George Norman thought. You can see where Abraham Lincoln and George Norman just can't connect with each other, maybe because the stakes were even higher for George Norman. But my point was, most of us, not everybody, but most of us appreciate Lincoln's creed, the need for people to use ballots and not bullets. But it takes patience, takes persistence, because change doesn't happen that fast. It takes multiple elections. It takes changes in judges. It's not easy. But the alternative can be anarchy and violence, and that's what Lincoln said about civil war and secession. And so that's always my message. It's not the message everybody wants to hear, especially right now when people are so angry, but I think it's the message that's going to keep us through another 250 years.
Okay, so let's pull on that a little bit. For
Okay.
you.
We have 90 seconds to pull on that.
Okay. I want to pull that a little bit with. So you get a pushback on Lincoln's belief of that with somebody like David Walker, who writes and pushes back on Lincoln and says, sure, so Lincoln's going to come out and say, you want this rule of law, and you're going to say don't have violence on it, but you also have to have people following the rule of law to not have violence, and people aren't following that rule of law because they're out there hurting people, and they're not being held accountable for it. So that doesn't always apply because some people are being asked to follow the rules and to not be violent, and then people are being extremely violent and not being held accountable for the violence that they show because that violence is on certain people because based on race, it's okay.
Right. Look, this is the conundrum. Not all laws are just. Not all outcomes are right. And how do you change them? Do you just declare them illegitimate and set up shop for yourself? That's what the Confederates did, when they seceded. Lincoln is always opposed to that. But there were plenty of people who said slavery itself is like tyranny, and we have to use any means necessary to resist it. You could see why that's appealing. And it feels unfair when you're playing by different sets of rules. And there's a tension there that exists. But my point in the book that I just wrote and in the way I teach Lincoln is, usually with Lincoln and figures, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison or David Walker or radicals like Salmon Chase or William Seward, the difference between them and Lincoln was not about left and right. It was about faster or slower. Lincoln wants to get to the same place as David Walker and Frederick Douglass and everybody else who wants to abolish slavery. But the question is, how fast do you do it? And Lincoln said, if you do it too fast, you'll wreck the country, you'll drive away potential allies, and it'll never happen. But if we figure out the right pace to get there, we can achieve it together. And of course, he was moving toward the containment of slavery, but just that step alone triggered secession, civil war, and then that accelerated the timeline to emancipation and abolition. But it's always about faster or slower. That's when friends argue. That's what they're arguing over.
Okay, so one last final question around this is you get this movement in Carlisle, you get this, what they deem a riot and somebody else would deem resistance. And again, labels matter and which word you choose matter. And we see it again in Boston. We see, people coming to capture their neighbor and taking what people believe in Boston is their neighbor and then bringing them, an enslaved person, back to the deep South. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but the line is, you take a bunch of people in Boston and watch their neighbor being taken away from them, brought back to the deep South, and you overnight turn a bunch of Bostonians from quiet little Bostonians into ardent abolitionist.
The quote was
from
an old Whig just like Lincoln, a conservative. He said, "We waked up stark, raving mad abolitionists." These former conservatives, after they captured Anthony Burns, a runaway slave, in 1854 and sent him back to Virginia.
And so when it's in your face, when you're seeing somebody you know, it gets real really fast and people get upset because now it's your neighbor. Now it's really close to you. It's not something that's happening in the South. It's your neighbor. It's the guy that you went into his shop and you bought something from. So these little moments of resistance popping up in the 1840s, the 1850s, they have this national impact. They boil up, in the Dred Scott case becomes a national moment. But these little moments, these little kind of constellations of resistance happen into these larger national moments, really, go and lead to the Civil War, to this resistance, to Lincoln making movements, to Frederick Douglass making movements. All of this builds up into this national tension, into the Civil War. How much of an impact did this moment in Carlisle have as one of those smaller moments to the bigger Big Bang moment that we would call the Civil War?
There were a series of these fugitive slave cases at the end of the 1840s that convinced people that the old law from 1793 wasn't working. So, have you ever heard of Henry Box Brown? Does that name ring a bell to you? This is one of the favorite stories in elementary school. They read about Henry Box Brown. He was shipped in a box from Richmond to Philadelphia in 1849, and he escaped from slavery.
Show them how small the box is.
Henry wrote about the size of the box. He was 5'7", and he was crunched up into it. But he made it, and he lived as a free man afterwards. But the Carlisle riot that ended up with the death of a slave catcher and Henry's escape 2 years later, they contributed to what became the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law as part of the Compromise. And that was the law that led to the capture of Anthony Burns and the moment when people began to change their minds. That story about Anthony Burns and the Whigs waking up, stark, raving, mad abolitionists, that was a turning point moment. Not everybody remembers it, but there was never another fugitive slave rendition from New England after 1854. And they did eventually, within a year, bring Anthony Burns back and free him. The church in Boston, the 10th Street Baptist Church, paid for his freedom. And the Boston Vigilance Committee stopped slave catchers from chasing down other black people in Boston. It's a remarkable story of resistance success, not resistance failure, from 1854 forward. Do we have time for one question here? Okay, good.
Talking about dissent and times now, what's going on now, do you feel that the No Kings protest has any effect as far as dissent?
So the question is, does No Kings protest have any impact? Protests always have an impact, and the impact is always impossible to measure. It's in the air, okay? But one thing is true: elections matter. And whatever protests or court cases or organizing people do, they have to funnel in an American democracy toward election results. They're the ones where you see the concrete consequences of people's opinions. And that's where, if you believe in something, you have to channel your energies ultimately toward electing people to office who share your views and then seeing those views become the majority. That's the part that takes patience.
Good answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Can everybody please give Professor Pinsker a big round of
Thank
applause?
you.
Thank you all for joining us. What I love about this story is that it's, for me, it always falls down into, sometimes it's just the few people. Sometimes it's just the professor walking across the quad, and sometimes it's just, the husband that is looking out for his wife. So it is always, sometimes it is the state law, sometimes it is the national law, but it really is just each other looking out for your neighbors. So thank you all very much. Thank you for your great questions. I hope you all have a great 4th of July. Thank you all. Have a good one.